In this second installment of my conversation with Jonah Goldberg, Jonah recounts the completion of his education at Goucher College and goes on to his struggles to find decent toilet paper as an expat in Eastern Europe, as well as hanging out in casinos all night long in Prague. Also, the importance of comic books to the origin stories of conservative thinkers. And finally, the development of his own political philosophy in the 1990s.
So after college...
What would you major in, first of all?
Oh, so I was a political science and history double major until my last year. And then when I realized that would require a senior thesis in both history and political science, I changed to a major in political science and a minor in history.
Right.
And the one thing I will say about Goucher, at least in the departments I cared about, it really was a good teaching school. And this professor of mine, a guy named Kay Munns, who died a few years ago, became a very good friend of mine and kind of a mentor. And he was a liberal. He was part of the Berkeley free speech movement, but he actually believed in teaching. And you wouldn't know he was a liberal from any of his classes. And what he liked were interesting arguments. And so it kind of didn't matter where you came from ideologically in his class if you were engaged in it. And he was a big influence on me. The class, it was a good, intimate teaching experience there. But I had a lot of, lacunae, a lot of gaps.
And were there other professors or particular classes that were really sort of significant or memorable?
It's funny. There were classes that came back to me years later that all of a sudden I realized that, wow, this was more interesting then than I realized. A lot of the stuff about Mosca and Pareto and elite theory and all of that, which when I started working on liberal fascism, I was like, I remember this, and and frankly, I liked a lot of the good women's studies stuff. I thought was very interesting and useful. Jean Baker, who was a professor at Goucher, who was also at Harvard, she's the biographer of the Stevenson family and wrote a big award-winning biography of Mary Todd Lincoln. She's a really impressive lady, so I guess it got my intellectual curiosity ramped up, which is probably the best I could say about it. At the same time, there was a lot of stupidity, and because it's an American college, right? And with the very few exceptions, and even at the great American small colleges, there is stupidity because humans are stupid and institutions are stupid, and that's how things work. But
well, now I had forgotten. I'd heard you tell the story once, but I don't think anybody knows this, or almost nobody except your friends know this. That you went off to Prague to be a young starving writer. Was it shortly afterwards, or am I out of order?
So
I think this is hilarious.
So after college, me and two buddies from high school had this idea of starting a newspaper in New York, and the idea was it was a good idea. Just we didn't know anything about how to do it, and after a summer of really just sort of wasting time discovering that we're not going to go out and raise millions of dollars and do this, I said I needed to get the hell out of here. And so I convinced a friend of mine, I went to Prague. And I went there because I knew about somebody else who had been there, and I thought it would be a cool adventure. And
about what time was this, by the way? Do you remember the year?
I graduated college in '91.
Okay.
And so by the end of the summer, I was in Prague.
Okay.
And so late August, I guess. And I got to Prague. The expats I got to know there, who had been there for a couple of years, they had much better stories about waiting online for toilet paper and rumors that there would be toilet paper in this part of town and racing that way and all that. I didn't have any of that, right? I had, the best you could say is that you would hear rumors that there are places that are selling good toilet paper, right? And so what is it, all advances from zero or infinite, right? Is something like you social science guys say. So any advancement on no toilet paper is huge, right? So bad toilet paper is much better than no toilet paper, and good toilet paper is only is better than bad toilet paper, but it's not the same thing. And it was a great place. I went to go be a starving writer, and I sort of batted 500. I didn't starve, and I didn't write. I started reading a lot of the books that I thought I should have read. And that was a great thing. This is pre-internet, right? And so there were no distractions like that. I actually was writing snail mail and all of that, and so I read War and Peace. I read a lot of that kind of stuff, and because it's a great cafe society for doing that. And I taught English sporadically. Basically, the most serious gig I had was 1 week out of the month. I would go up and teach chemical factory managers in northern Bohemia, which was a fascinating thing to do, and you learned a lot. And it was an intensive 1 week thing, and I learned how unbelievably difficult it is to teach American football to people who don't know how to play it. And so anyway, my buddy and I, we got into this thing where we would go to the casinos, and the Western casinos, or the casinos in Prague, were sort of just getting their sea legs up, and they were, and the way East Europeans in particular gamble is very staid, very quiet, very demure. And so the pit boss was this South African guy, loved having me and my buddy in because we were loud and we were boozy and we were flirting with these unbelievably cute dealers, and so we would he would ply us with free booze and free food all night if we stayed. And so we always had this dilemma. We would get there around 8 or 9, and then midnight is when the public trains in Prague stopped running. And so we would have to have this sort of dilemma of, do we want to ride it out all night till 6 a.m. when the trains start again, or do we want to go home right now? And usually we stayed till 6 a.m., which was really cool because when we would make it back to our apartments, because we changed apartments a bunch, you would see all the factory workers heading to the bars before work, which is just a great look. And so anyway, we had a great time doing that. My friend left before I did, and then I had some family stuff that I had to leave before I wanted to. And I came back to the States. My girlfriend at the time was at American University Law School, and in Washington. And so I came back and hung out with her. And I did this sort of informational interview thing at the American Enterprise Institute with Ben Wattenberg. And I got the job. I didn't know that there was a job when I had the interview. It was basically, the deal was I would take an internship with the understanding that if it worked out, I would replace Ben's research assistant who was heading off to University of Texas, named Tevi Troy.
Oh my goodness.
So I've known Tevi for 25, for people who don't know, Tevi, former number 2 at HHS, number 2 at Bush's Domestic Policy Council, former Hudson Institute scholar, has written a bunch of books. So he was the research assistant at AEI for Ben Wattenberg before me. I got the job in large part because Ben had asked me what books I was reading, and I said I was reading Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man. What I didn't tell him was I was only 17 pages in, and he asked me, I've never been able to understand what that book is about, can you explain it? And I said, well, it has to do with how it's not really the end of history, it's how you define historical progress, and it has to do with Hegel and blah, 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 blah. I don't know how well I did, but I did well enough that Ben believed I had the right answer, and Tevi thought it was okay. And so I got the job, and I worked as Ben's research assistant for a while. I had my tensions with Ben, which we don't probably need to get into. Ben was a great American and a decent guy, but he was a difficult... No man is a hero to his valet, let's leave it at that. And but I learned an incredible large amount of stuff in those years. I also got, because Ben was traveling so much, and when he was off working on a book or whatever, there was like these long gaps in the schedule, and I basically turned AEI into my grad school. And so there were all these things that I knew a little bit about Leo Strauss. I was taught in Goucher to hate Leo Strauss, but they would never explain why, which only made him more enticing.
Of course.
And so, I started reading, I'll tell you a true story just back at Goucher, because you'll like this, and it's for all of you people. I did a paper on Nietzsche for a philosophy class, and I quoted from the Strauss and Cropsey political history book, and I guess is it Werner Dannhauser?
Dannhauser, yeah.
And I quoted something about Nietzsche, and it's just a footnote, on page 4 of this paper, and my professor circles the footnote in giant red ink, and then draws a line up to the side, and then in huge block letters writes along the entire margin of the paper, Strauss sucks. And
how terribly academic and professional.
yes,
of him.
and so, but, I mean, what better way to chum the water for me to be interested in Leo Strauss, right? So anyway, and so that was back when Walter Burns was still around and kicking at AEI. Robert Bork was there.
Irving was the round.
Irving Kristol. You know, when you said you want me to talk about influences, I didn't really read much of any of Irving Kristol growing up. But then this conference that I helped organize for Ben, that was part of the thing I was brought on to do, Irving spoke, and it was like listening to my dad. And I took this instant fascination with Irving. And, you know, I would read stuff like, you know, The American Revolution as a Successful Revolution, which had a huge impact on me. I probably I became really good friends with all the guys from the Public Interest, which is this now defunct magazine, which has been a journal, which National Affairs is sort of the heir to. And I probably got jobs for at least 2 or 3 people at the Public Interest, because I would tell friends, and so my closest friends were research assistants at AEI who were working for people like Bork, and editors at the Public Interest.
Right. So, I mean, is it fair to say that your sort of serious education and political thought really didn't start till you got to AEI? I mean, had you read like Hayek on your own, or?
I think that's probably fair. I think one way, and this is probably forced, and I've never used this analogy, right? But, I don't mean to sound nearly as grandiose as it may sound. I don't know. You remember in The Karate Kid, the way Mr. Miyagi teaches Daniel how to do it? Paint the fence, wax the floor, right? My dad was a really deeply philosophical, smart guy who knew a lot about a lot, and he was a real student of history. He was all but dissertation from University of Michigan for Eastern European history, and you know, I learned more about the Serbian Black Hand before I was 10, you know, than I ever have since. And so in some ways, my dad was not up on all the nomenclature of the conservative movement. But the forms were all sort of there. So
I sort of familiar in a certain way.
I took to it really easily.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I had a long talk with Jonathan Adler about this once. Jonathan Adler is also a comic book geek. Ramesh Ponnuru is a comic book geek. Tevi Troy is a comic book geek. There's something about a certain subset of comic book geeks who are fascinated with the origin stories of people. And so books like Nash's The Conservative Intellectual Movement Since '45 read to me like the origin stories of a bunch of superheroes. I mean, that's how I still go back through it all the time. And so I immediately felt comfortable going to school and all of this stuff. And for me, obviously there were huge things I needed to learn and fill in the blanks on. But it was like discovering a language that I hadn't had a facility for.
Right. Well, now, so you mentioned Irving Kristol, and of course, what most people think about him is he's so capacious, right?
Right.
And I'd say the same thing about you. You also, this isn't quite right, and maybe we can sort this out. You are sort of like not the last fusionist, but you have a very large sort of fusionist streak in you, even though there's problems with it, right? I mean, the Meyer thing was unsuccessful, but and I mean that's you figured that out, or at least you're comfortable with trying to do that more so than a lot of people who want to sort of stay, you know, you're either purely libertarian or you're purely a Kirkian, and you know. By the way, I try. My instincts or disposition is exactly the same way. Is to fuse them together. It seems to me you can do that a lot of the time, right? Is there a particular? Was that? How self-conscious was that of a direction that you took? Or is that?
Oh, I don't know.
Too weird of a question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just find internecine intellectual squabbles fascinating, right? I mean, I just do. It's sort of my thing. I just find them interesting, and. That was one that was part of the origin story of National Review, right? And this whole idea of reconciling the, you know, back then they would call the individualist ethos, right? Not necessarily libertarian, right? And
freedom versus virtue.
Right. Because remember, even Friedrich Hayek didn't call himself a libertarian.
Right.
And so I always just sort of found those arguments really interesting. I've always found, you know, so I became a television producer for this TV show Think Tank, right? And one of the things I really took away from that was that all of the really interesting arguments are intramural, not extramural, right? Left-right arguments have too much of what Tom Sowell called conflict of visions, right? You can't get off go. You don't share enough assumptions. Unless you're really careful about it and you start with Aristotle or something, right? I mean, I'm sure you professor types know how to do this, but arguments between libertarians and conservatives, or different kinds of libertarians and different kinds of conservatives, are much more interesting to me because you have a set of shared assumptions, and it's fascinating to me to see where the divergences come, right? That, you know, there's not a conservative out there that doesn't believe in most libertarian principles. But they take those principles in different directions. And I find that stuff really just plain interesting. And so I don't know, there was no thunderclap moment for it that I can think of. I mean, the very first panel I ever did in Washington was on the Weekly Standard's push for national greatness, which all the libertarians hated, right? And the line I had about it then is the line I still use about it to this day, is never have I been so torn about an issue that matters so little. But I think where I come down to it in a good Claremonstery kind of way, I think, is on subsidiarity, right? On federalism, right? I am an extremely libertarian guy at the federal level. But I'm extremely open to communitarianism on the local level, and so I'm sure you've had the same experience. You know, in D.C., once every 3 months, there's some panel argument between a bunch of conservatives and libertarians about some issue, and some mouth-breathing, you know, intern in the back of the room raises his hand and says, "Excuse me, isn't it true that if we just went back to the constitutional order as envisioned by the founders, where we push these things to the lowest democratic level possible, this would solve all of your objections?" And the libertarians and the conservatives alike always say, yeah, you know, because it would. I mean, there are very few issues that actually deserve to be federal issues, so to speak. And so it's one of the dorkier passions to have, but I actually like that federalism argument a lot, because it lets... The way I always put it is federalism, by which I mean pushing these things most local level possible, is the best system ever conceived of for maximizing human happiness, because it lets and it's a mathematical proposition. This isn't some theoretical thing. I can do the work on the board for you. It is the best system ever created to let the most, numerically speaking, the most people live the way they want to live, and that's sort of what this country is supposed to be about.